Not all great knights are remembered for the dragons they slayed or the battles they won. Some are remembered for the wars they waged inside themselves, quiet, painful, and impossible to win. That's where Lancelot's story really begins. He wasn't just the strongest sword at Arthur's round table, he was the beating heart of it, the champion, the one others looked to when the odds were bad, when the walls were closing in. He always rose to the moment, always fought like the world was watching. But that wasn't what made him unforgettable. It was the weight he carried. Because behind all that glory, Lancelot was a man divided. Between honor and love, between loyalty to his king and devotion to the queen. He didn't chase scandal, he didn't seek tragedy. But life doesn't always let you choose the parts you play. The strange thing is, no one ever really doubted his intentions. His fellow knights may have whispered when he passed by, and the court may have fallen silent when he and Guinevere locked eyes across the hall, but no one ever questioned his courage, or his heart. It was obvious he would die for Camelot if he had to. He just couldn't stop himself from loving what was forbidden. And that's what makes his story hard to shake. It's not about perfection, it's about someone who tried, who kept trying, even when everything he loved began to tear him apart. This is the story of Sir Lancelot du Lac, the greatest knight from Arthurian legends. Before the wars, before the betrayal, before the legend, there was just a boy, born into a kingdom already unraveling. Lancelot's life began in a place few remember clearly now, Benwick. It was a small realm, proud and loyal to King Arthur's cause in the earliest days. His father, King Ban, wasn't the most powerful king in Britain, but he was brave, stubbornly so, and for a time that counted for something. But kingdoms rise and fall faster than most stories can keep up with. Ban's enemies came in hard, burning villages, poisoning alliances, tearing the kingdom down from the inside out. With no help in sight, Ban fled with his wife, Queen Elaine, and their baby son. There was no dramatic escape, no last stand, just a desperate ride through dark woods while the kingdom behind them burned. And then Ban died. Some say his heart gave out when he saw his home go up in flames. Others say he was struck by one last arrow from a pursuing enemy. Either way, he died there in the forest, in a quiet clearing, with nothing left but ashes behind him and a crying child in his arms. Elaine, still clutching her baby, still grieving, might have died next, if not for what happened next. The mists rolled in, the kind that shouldn't exist in the middle of a sunlit day, and out of them stepped someone not quite of this world, the Lady of the Lake. No one really agrees on what she is, a spirit, a sorceress, something older. Doesn't matter. What does matter is that she took the child, gently without a word, and vanished with him into the mists. That was the last the world saw of Lancelot for years. He grew up in a realm untouched by time, hidden beneath still waters and behind veils no man could cross. The lady raised him like a son, but trained him like a weapon. There were no other children, no games, just endless lessons. Swordplay, horsemanship, courtly manners, strategy. The kind of things most boys don't even think about until they're older. Lancelot had no choice. The lady wasn't cruel, but she had expectations. She saw in him something more than just a boy, and she was determined to shape it into something useful. It's said he once trained for 3 days straight without rest, just to earn the right to hold a real blade. By the time he was a young man, he could beat grown knights in sparring with one hand behind his back. But there was a quiet sadness in him even then, something about growing up in a place with no sky, no seasons, no laughter, just the still hush of the lake and the pressure of perfection leaves a mark. When the lady finally let him return to the world of men, he didn't come back as a boy trying to find his way. He came back as Lancelot du Lac, and every knight in Camelot would soon know his name. When Lancelot first rode into Camelot, people noticed, even if they didn't yet understand what they were seeing. He didn't arrive with a host of retainers or banners flapping behind him. No flourishes, no loud declarations. Just a man on horseback, moving like he belonged. He was tall but not towering, lean muscle wrapped in the kind of poise that came from years of discipline. His dark hair fell straight to his shoulders, cleanly kept, not vain but precise. His eyes, blue with a strange depth, had a way of landing on people like they were puzzles he'd already solved. You could talk to him for 10 minutes and still feel like you hadn't really met him. He wore armor with care. It wasn't flashy, but it fit him like a second skin, silvered plate, engraved only in small, deliberate places, no unnecessary polish, no ostentation. Later, when he took the lion as his emblem, that quiet strength became a symbol, not a roar, a presence. But Lancelot wasn't just a look. He wasn't the kind of man you only noticed once. The more time people spent around him, the more the mystery deepened. He spoke softly, rarely. He listened more than he answered. He wasn't cold, but there was something distant about him, like he was always holding something back. He followed the code of chivalry, yes, but not because it was expected. For him, it was something closer to faith, mercy, honor, courage, loyalty. They weren't ideals he reached for. They were rules he lived by, carved into his bones. Still, for all that restraint, Lancelot wasn't without edge. He could be proud. He could be reckless in the right circumstances. He didn't tolerate cruelty. And when he saw injustice, on the battlefield or in the quiet corners of the kingdom, he acted, immediately, decisively. But his most dangerous trait wasn't anger or pride, it was love. He loved deeply even when he didn't want to, and when it came to the people he cared for, Arthur, Guinevere, and a few scattered others, there was nothing he wouldn't risk, no rule he wouldn't break. That's where the cracks began to show. In battle, though, all of that fell away. He became something else entirely. Lancelot fought like no one else in Camelot. He didn't rely on brute force or sheer aggression. He fought with precision, calm, calculation. He could read an opponent's stance in a single breath and end a fight in 3 moves. In tournaments, he was dominant. On the battlefield, he was a storm wrapped in steel. He could ride for hours, swing a blade with unbroken rhythm, and come out the other side with barely a scratch. But his skill wasn't just physical. He understood people. He could read a room, sense betrayal before it bloomed, de-escalate conflicts with just a few well-placed words. He was a warrior, yes, but also a tactician, a diplomat, a quiet leader. The court came to respect him. Some feared him, many envied him, and more than a few fell in love with the idea of him, even if they never truly knew the man underneath the armor. Because behind all that power, behind the code, the victories, the titles, was still that boy from across the waters, shaped by the lake, carved by silence, and already walking the path that would one day bring Camelot to its knees. When Lancelot finally arrived at Camelot, Arthur greeted him not with suspicion but recognition. The king had known of the boy, of course. This child taken by the Lady of the Lake, trained in some realm no man could find. He had expected him someday, though perhaps not quite like this. Lancelot wasn't a boy anymore. He was already forged. And he didn't come with demands. No lands, no titles, no claim to power. He simply asked to serve. Arthur didn't say yes right away. Not because he doubted Lancelot's strength, but because Camelot didn't take knighthood lightly, especially not for strangers. But he watched. He listened. He sent knights to test this newcomer, on foot, on horseback, in the tilt yard. And each time, the result was the same. Lancelot didn't just win. He dismantled his opponents without cruelty, without pride. Just clean, methodical brilliance. Within days it became clear. This man wasn't just another hopeful warrior. He was something else entirely. And the court, which had once eyed him with caution, began to shift. Arthur called him forward in the great hall. Sunlight poured through the stained glass, turning the stone floor into a mosaic of color. The round table stood behind the king, unbroken, full of knights who had built their names on loyalty and blood. And in front of them all, Lancelot knelt. He didn't flinch when the blade touched his shoulders, didn't tremble when the vows were spoken. When Arthur named him Sir Lancelot du Lac, it felt less like a beginning and more like a recognition. Like something that had always been true was finally being said aloud. That day, the Round Table gained not just a new knight, but a new axis. And whether they knew it or not, everyone in that room felt it. Something had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same again. This part of Lancelot's story doesn't take place on the battlefield. There's no grand quest, no cursed sword or enemy champion. Just a tournament, a quiet house, and a girl who loved too deeply. It started in Astolat, a smaller, peaceful holding, ruled by Sir Bernard, one of Arthur's older allies. The king had announced a grand tournament, drawing knights from across the realm. Lancelot intended to ride, but in disguise, as he often did. He wanted to test his strength without the pressure that came with his name. So he stopped in Astolat along the way, asking hospitality from Sir Bernard and requesting a favor that, to him, was simple. A lady's token, a small emblem, something worn to show favor in the jousts. It was tradition, strategic even. Wearing an unknown token helped protect his identity. But to Elaine, Sir Bernard's daughter, it wasn't strategy. Elaine was young, sheltered, and untested by the harder edges of life. She had grown up on stories of knights and valor, of Lancelot most of all. To her, he wasn't just a warrior. He was everything good and noble rolled into one. So when he arrived, quiet and kind and effortlessly strong, it didn't take long for her to fall in love. And when he asked for her token, her red sleeve, she gave it with trembling hands and the kind of hope that doesn't leave room for doubt. The tournament was brutal. Lancelot fought like a storm behind a borrowed shield, using his left hand to further disguise himself. He won match after match, unhorsing even the finest of Arthur's court. But his victories came at a cost. He was badly wounded, too hurt to return publicly. So instead, he vanished. To the court, it was a mystery. To Elaine, it was heartbreak. She feared the worst, that the man she'd come to love had died wearing her colors. But he hadn't. He had been found and hidden away in the care of a holy hermit, where he healed slowly, stubbornly. When Elaine learned the truth, she insisted on caring for him. She sat at his side, cleaned his wounds, and spoke gently when the pain took over. And Lancelot, grateful, patient, respectful, let her. He didn't return her affection, but he didn't deny her kindness either. She nursed him for 10 days. On the 11th, when he was strong enough to leave, she told him she loved him. Not with fanfare or expectation, just the truth. Lancelot listened, and then, with the gentlest voice he could manage, he told her no. Not cruelly, not dismissively, just the truth in return. His heart, already buried in silence and shadows, belonged to someone else. And no matter how pure Elaine's love was, he couldn't give her what she asked for. She didn't beg. She didn't scream. She let him go. And days later, a small boat floated down the river toward Camelot. Inside it was a girl in a white gown, her hands folded, a letter at her side. She had died of grief, and the boat had carried her to the king's court as if by fate. Arthur read the letter aloud. It spoke of love, of sorrow, and of forgiveness. Elaine asked only that her story be remembered, that her heart be honored. Lancelot stood still as stone, saying nothing, but the loss etched itself into him, a reminder that even the kindest lies, the quiet, merciful ones, can still leave scars. Elaine of Astolat became known as the Lily Maid, and though her tale is often overshadowed by queens and wars, it lingers, not for its drama, but for its pain. There are tournaments, and then there's the one that happened at Sir Lew's. Most knights remember it not for the victory, but for what it revealed, about rivalries, resentments, and just how thin the bonds of Camelot had become. It was meant to be a celebration. Knights from every corner of Britain and even beyond gathered to test their skill, honor their kings, and remind the realm what chivalry looked like in motion. Lancelot, despite the quiet tension following the Elaine of Astolat affair, chose to attend openly this time. No disguises, no borrowed shields, just him, his lion-emblazoned banner, and the weight of every eye that followed it. From the moment he rode onto the field, it was clear this wasn't going to be a fair fight. He was the standard by which all others were measured, and it wasn't just Arthur's knights watching him this time. Men from Orkney, from Gales, from rival courts with old grudges and long memories, all lined up to test themselves against him, or take him down. Lancelot, as always, answered the challenge. He fought cleanly, perfectly. Rider after rider hit the dirt. Sword matches ended in a matter of moments. His lance never splintered without purpose. And yet, the more he won, the colder the mood became. It wasn't admiration anymore, it was bitterness. Even within Arthur's circle, certain knights, particularly those loyal to Gawain's side of the family, started to shift uncomfortably. Lancelot was Arthur's favorite, no one doubted that. But favorites cast long shadows. By the third day of the tournament, the tension boiled over. Small provocations turned into real slights. Knights accused one another of dishonor. Old rivalries reignited. On the final day, when all was supposed to culminate in one grand show of unity, the field fractured. Lines were drawn in the dirt not just for combat but for loyalty. Lancelot fought on, unshaken as the tourney edged into something that no longer looked like sport. There were too many swords drawn, too many glances that lingered long after the fighting ended. And when the dust settled, Lancelot stood victorious, but alone. Fewer cheers, more silence, whispers trailing behind him like smoke. It should have been another feather in his cap. Instead, it felt like a warning. Arthur, watching from the royal stand, wore a grim look that said more than any words could. The kingdom was shifting. The cracks weren't just in stone or steel. They were in trust. And Lancelot, for all his brilliance, had become a wedge without meaning to. The tournament at Surluse didn't just test strength, it exposed fault lines. And the deeper they ran, the harder everything would fall. Hey everyone, just a quick intermission here. I wanted to say thank you for watching this video. It really means a lot to me. Did you know that over 80% of you who are watching right now aren't subscribed to the channel? If you've enjoyed this content so far, it would be incredible if you could hit that subscribe button. It's a small gesture, but it really helps the channel grow and ensures that you won't miss any more of our fascinating stories we explore together. Also, if you're feeling generous, please give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment, and share with anyone else who may enjoy it. Your support really does make a difference and keeps the content coming. Thanks again, and let's get back to the story. After Surluse, no one questioned it anymore. Lancelot was the best knight in Britain, maybe in all the world. He didn't rise to that title because he claimed it. He earned it, fight by fight, scar by scar. There was no arena too crowded, no enemy too fierce, no challenge he wouldn't meet head-on. The other knights admired him, even if some couldn't stand him. Kings welcomed him even when his shadow threatened to outshine theirs. Bards sang about him. Pages whispered his name like a spell. But Lancelot never seemed to care about that. He wasn't chasing fame, and he wasn't trying to climb some invisible ladder. He just fought because he was asked to, or because someone needed him, or sometimes because he didn't know how to be anything else. In battle, he was cold fire, controlled, precise, unrelenting. He didn't waste movement. He didn't show off. His opponents never walked away confused about what had happened. If they were lucky, they walked away at all. And yet, off the field, he was a man of restraint, always watching, always listening. He didn't talk about his victories. He didn't sit at the high table unless summoned. When others feasted, he trained. When they laughed, he thought. He carried himself like a knight still trying to earn his own respect. It was that balance, fierce in combat, humble in character, that made him so impossible to match. He became the one everyone turned to. When a town was raided, they asked for Lancelot. When a bridge was held by a rogue knight, it was Lancelot who cleared it. When rumors spread of a cursed beast in the woods or a damsel held in a tower too high for ladders, it was Lancelot they sent. And he never said no. He faced enchantresses, giants, traitors, and bandits, some with names, most without. Some stories are lost. Others never made it into song. But through them all, one thing stayed constant. Lancelot won. But there's something lonely about being the best. The victories pile up, the praise becomes routine, and little by little the distance between you and everyone else starts to grow. He still laughed with Gawain, still sparred with Bors, still drank quietly in the great hall when the fire burned low. But even among friends, there was always something separate about him, like a man walking through the same world but never quite in step with it. And then there was Guinevere, the queen who watched him in silence, the one person in Camelot who could make him falter without ever lifting a blade. That was when the trouble really began. Not with war, but with a glance, and the kind of love that has no place in a king's court. It started quietly, how all dangerous things do. No fireworks, no whispered vows, just a look here, a word there, a sense that something invisible was pulling them closer. Lancelot had always been loyal to Queen Guinevere. That wasn't strange. Every knight in Camelot owed her their respect, but his loyalty, his devotion, ran deeper. You could see it in how he stood a little straighter when she entered a room, how his eyes would follow her, not possessively, just protectively, like she was the one thing he'd guard with his life, even if no one asked him to. He became her champion, officially sure, but more than that in every way that mattered. He wore her token in tourneys, rode in her name, fought like her honor was the only thing that ever needed defending. And she let him. Guinevere was clever, sharp, not one to fall easily or recklessly. But Lancelot, he wasn't like the others. He didn't flirt, he didn't posture, he didn't try to charm her. He just was, steady, quiet. A storm that never bragged about the thunder. Over time, their bond deepened, not in grand gestures, but in those small, loaded moments, the silence when their eyes met across the court, the brief touch of her hand as she offered him a favor, the weight of unsaid things hanging in the space between them. The court noticed, of course. At first, it was harmless gossip, squires teasing each other, ladies smirking behind veils. The Queen's Knight, they called him, and Lancelot bore it with the same calm he brought to the battlefield. But the whispers got louder, meaner, because people are quick to tarnish anything that shines too bright. Still, neither of them crossed the line, not yet. They told themselves it was loyalty, honor, restraint. But truthfully, it was fear. Fear of what would happen if they ever let go. Because this wasn't a love that could live in the open, not between a queen and her husband's most trusted knight. And yet every time she looked at him, every time he knelt at her feet before a tournament, they both knew the truth. They were already lost to each other, and one day that would cost them everything. No one knows exactly when it happened, but eventually it crossed the line. Not loudly, not with scandal, just with a kiss. One kiss that made every oath feel distant, every consequence quiet. And once the door opened, there was no shutting it again. They met in secret, sometimes in the gardens after moonrise, sometimes behind the chapel when the court was still asleep. It was never often and never safe, but it didn't matter. Every stolen moment felt like a lifetime. Lancelot, who had always lived by the code, began breaking it piece by piece, silently, shamefully, willingly. And Guinevere, who had worn her crown with dignity and distance, now carried a secret that weighed more than gold. They told no one, not Arthur, not even their closest friends. But court life is made of eyes and ears. Whispers curled through Camelot like smoke. The queen is too fond of her knight. Lancelot never leaves her side. Why does he never look at another woman? Still they held on, because for all the guilt and risk, it felt like the only honest thing they'd ever known. Not lust, not fantasy, but love. The kind that burns slow and deep, that lives in the quiet spaces between sacrifice and longing. But love, when it lives in the dark, turns sharp. Lancelot began to change. He became more reckless in battle, more withdrawn at court. Guinevere grew colder to others, sharper-tongued, as if keeping the world at arm's length could protect what they had. Neither one of them smiled as easily anymore, and around them the walls began to close in. It started with a whisper, as all ruin does, and then it became a plan. Mordred and Agravain, sons of Orkney, knights of the Round Table, and bitter men with colder ambitions, decided enough was enough. They'd watched Lancelot rise too high, grow too close. They'd watched Guinevere drift too far from the king, and more than anything, they saw an opportunity, not just to wound Arthur, but to unmake everything he'd built. So they brought the accusation to him, not as gossip, but as hard truth. They told Arthur that Lancelot and Guinevere were lovers, that the most trusted knight and the crown's own queen had betrayed him under his very roof. They said they had proof. They said they could catch them. And Arthur? He didn't want to believe it. For a moment, just a moment, he hesitated. This was Lancelot. This was Guinevere, his closest friend, his dearest love. If there was doubt, even a sliver, he wanted to cling to it. But Arthur was king, and kings don't get the luxury of blind faith. So he gave the order. A trap was laid. One final cruel test. Mordred and Agravain led a band of knights to burst into Guinevere's chamber in the dead of night. They'd waited until Arthur was away from court. They wanted no delays, no hesitation. But they got more than they bargained for. Lancelot was there, and he did not run. Steel met steel. In the dark corridors of Camelot, swords rang out like thunder. Blood hit stone. Screams followed. Knights who had once broken bread together now struck to kill. Lancelot fought his way out, but not without cost. When Arthur returned, the wreckage was waiting for him. His queen imprisoned, his knights divided, his court steeped in silence and sorrow. And though part of him still loved them both, he did what duty demanded. He sentenced Guinevere to die, burned at the stake, publicly, without exception. And as the pyre was built and the crowds gathered, Lancelot returned once more. This time, not in shadow. He rode through the smoke, a lion carved in flesh and fury. He struck down the guards, scattered the crowd, cut through every man who raised a blade. Among the dead were Gawain's younger brothers, Gaheris and Gareth. They hadn't drawn their swords. They hadn't come for battle, but they were there. And in the chaos, they died by Lancelot's hand. That, more than anything, broke the Round Table. He lifted Guinevere into his arms and vanished into the woods beyond Camelot. And the king? He didn't speak for a long time, but when he did, the words carried like iron through the court. There would be war. Not between kingdoms, but between brothers. Between past and present. Between what Camelot had promised and what it had become. The conflict that followed wasn't just a battle over land or power. It was a war of heartbreak, a collapse of the very ideals Camelot once stood for. And at the center of it all were two men who had once trusted each other beyond question, Arthur and Lancelot. When Guinevere was rescued from the flames, Lancelot didn't just save a queen. He shattered the law. He broke the unspoken contract that held the kingdom together. And in doing so, he set fire to everything he had once sworn to protect. Arthur couldn't ignore it. Whether his heart still loved them both or not, he was a king. And kings do not flinch when the world demands justice. His decision was made the moment the blood hit the courtyard stones. During the many battles, Guinevere was eventually retrieved and sent back to Camelot to hide and avoid further scandal. But Lancelot, he rode home to Joyous Gard, his fortress and final refuge. And Arthur came for him. He didn't come alone. He brought his army, knights, banners, siege engines, and among them rode Gawain, no longer just a brother in arms, but a grieving man hungry for vengeance. His brothers, Gareth and Gaheris, had died at Lancelot's hand, caught in the chaos of Guinevere's rescue. Lancelot hadn't known who they were, not until it was too late. But knowledge didn't change the outcome, and Gawain never forgave him. What followed was the siege of Joyous Gard, a battle soaked not just in blood, but in silence. Lancelot didn't meet Arthur on the field at first. He stayed behind his walls, hoping, some say praying, that this wasn't how things had to end. He sent envoys, offered peace, asked for forgiveness, but no offer could undo what had been done. The siege dragged on, days into weeks. Skirmishes broke out at the gates. Tensions flared inside and out. Lancelot's men stayed loyal, but weariness crept in. And through it all, Gawain stood at the front, demanding trial by combat. Over and over again, he challenged Lancelot to face him, and when the gates finally opened, Lancelot met him sword for sword. They fought once, then again, then again. Each time Lancelot defeated him, but never delivered the final blow. He couldn't. Not to Gawain. Not after all they'd shared. He begged him to stop. But Gawain's grief had hardened into hatred, and he would not yield. So Lancelot kept winning and Gawain kept rising, each duel pushing them both closer to ruin. Eventually, word came from across the sea. Mordred had taken Camelot, declared Arthur dead, claimed Guinevere as his bride. And with that, Arthur turned his army away from Joyous Gard. Not because the siege had ended, but because something worse had begun. Lancelot watched them leave, his castle still standing, but hollow. Everything he had fought to preserve had crumbled around him. He tried to follow, to return to Arthur's side, to make amends in whatever way was left. But he didn't, and that would be his biggest regret. Lancelot would eventually return to Britain, though his arrival was less than ideal. Arthur had turned his army homeward, Mordred had taken the throne, and Gawain, wounded and weary, was dying. Gawain had written to him, not with anger, not with blame, but with something gentler, a plea. One final letter asking Lancelot to come back, to return to the king he had once sworn himself to the dream they had both fought for even when they stood on opposite sides. But the letter came too late. By the time Lancelot reached the shores of Britain, the battle at Camlan had already been fought. The fields were still red, the banners were still torn, and Arthur, his king, his brother-in-arms, was gone. Some say Lancelot rode alone through the aftermath, moving past broken shields and shattered helms, searching for something he couldn't name. Others say he dismounted and walked the field in silence, his armor streaked with dust and seawater, not even realizing he was weeping until he tasted salt that wasn't from the wind. He asked where the king had fallen. No one could give him a clear answer, just vague gestures toward the hill where Arthur had struck down Mordred and been struck down in return. Gawain had died days before the battle, his wounds too deep, his heart finally spent. Whatever forgiveness or peace the two might have found was buried with him. Guinevere had vanished to a convent. The round table was shattered. The dream they had all clung to had slipped between their fingers like ash. And Lancelot, who had fought to protect it, who had fled to preserve it, who had returned too late to save it, stood alone in the quiet ruin. He never spoke of what he saw, never told the monks who later took him in what that field looked like, or how it felt to arrive when the swords were already still. But those who saw him said he was different after that. Not broken, just hollow. The truth is, Camelot didn't end with a grand betrayal or some final curse. It ended in silence, in the breath after the storm, in the moment when the last knight arrives to find nothing left to fight for. Because the king was gone, the queen was lost, and the greatest knight in the realm had come home, only to find there was no home left. Lancelot didn't vanish. Not right away. He stayed just long enough to feel the weight of it all, the burned banners, the shattered shields, the silence where Arthur's voice used to be. He walked the ruins of what once was, the battlefield, the empty halls, the broken round table, its edges cracked, its seats overturned. Camelot was gone, and with it, everything he had ever lived for. So he left. Not as a knight retreating, not as a man in shame, but as someone who simply had nothing left to fight for. He rode alone, no crest, no retinue, only a rusting sword, and a silence so heavy it seemed to cling to his armor. Eventually, he found her, or what remained of her. Guinevere had taken vows at a convent hidden in the countryside. She had cast off her jewels, her title, and most of her name. No longer queen, no longer anyone's, just a woman seeking penance for a life she could never truly escape. Lancelot went to her, not with expectation but with grief. And when he saw her, not draped in silks, but in a simple habit, her hair shorn and her eyes tired, he knew they were done. She asked him to leave. He didn't argue. They had loved each other truly, but they had broken too much along the way to carry it forward. All that was left now was prayer and peace and quiet distance. So he returned to the wilderness not to wander, but to disappear, to let go. Deep in a remote monastery, he found something like rest. The monks knew who he was. They all did. But they never said his name aloud. He became just another brother. No stories, no sword, just daily work and silence, and the slow, steady healing of a man worn thin. And then one day word reached them. Guinevere was dead. Lancelot didn't weep. He didn't speak. He just turned and walked into the chapel. He fasted for 6 days. On the 7th, they found him kneeling at the altar, head bowed, hands folded. He had died there, quiet as snow. The monks buried him beneath a simple stone. No grand tomb, no gold-trimmed inscription, just one carving at the base. A lion resting. Because in the end, Lancelot du Lac, champion of Arthur, lover of Guinevere, knight of unmatched skill, wasn't remembered for how many battles he won. He was remembered for how deeply he loved, and how much that love cost him.